One of my first assignments for the Times, and what it showed me about the paper, in this arc that's described in my book, Suppressed, of going from naivete to some cynicism, to which I confess, having been this sort of reporter, investigative reporter in Washington and so on, and I covered the Nixon White House and what have you, right? At Harvard, I had gone to Harvard, and I was, I don't know, at the time, say 27, so half a dozen years later, there were riots, large riots by Harvard and Radcliffe students. At the time, Radcliffe was the women's college associated with Harvard. They were rioting. Lots of students were rioting. So the National Desk sent me to Harvard to cover the riots. I show up, and it's a bit awkward always trying to cover mass events in a stadium or something of that sort on your own. I was covering it, and the head of Harvard, everybody wanted to interview him, the president. His name was Nathan Marsh Pusey. So he wouldn't speak to anybody in the media, nobody. I was in Harvard Yard one day, which is the sort of symbolic home of the campus where the freshman dormitories are. And so I had been in a dormitory there 10 years earlier or something. And I was looking around the yard and looking at my old dormitory. And I turned around, and who did I see coming across Harvard Yard? Walking by himself in a topcoat. Nathan Marsh Pusey. I got out my reporter's notebook. It's a vertical notebook. It says on the front of it, reporter's notebook. And I walked quickly across the yard and caught up with President Pusey. I identified myself and said I was with the New York Times. And I then began to walk alongside him, take notes, and interview him. And he responded to me. It was amazing. I was a kid. I said, wow, this is a wonderful interview, not because he's saying explosive things or something, but because he is answering my questions about these riots and so on the record. So I was thrilled. I wrote the story. I was proud of myself even, I suppose. And I got a phone call around, 4:30 that afternoon. And who was down the other end of the wire? It was the editor, or an editor of the paper, Scotty Reston, formerly known as James B. Reston. Scotty Reston, a divinity, a god for young journalists. He was a columnist for the paper and ran the Washington Bureau and so on. And a remarkable man in journalism. He was invited finally to China. I think he was the first journalist in, and he managed to get appendicitis while in China and had his appendix removed at People's Hospital No. 1 or something in Beijing. And we, crazily enough, envied him for having had the opportunity to write these front page stories about an appendectomy in China. Anyway, Scotty was on the other end of the line. And he said, Bob, do you think we're being hard on President Pusey? I had no idea what he meant. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, he's under a lot of stress and pressure there. I said, well, Scotty, I had my reporter's notebook out. I identified myself. I was taking notes. I was asking questions. He answered. He said, still, he's under great pressure. I said, well, yeah, I suppose he is under pressure. There's a lot of rioting going on here. He said, why don't we pass on this one? Can you imagine being in my circumstance? You're a young reporter, a kid. On this assignment, you've managed somehow to get this story. And here is God on the other end of the wire killing your story. And kill it, he did. And the story did not appear. Now, why do you suppose a very powerful figure in American journalism at the New York Times killed my story. There is another part to that story. I was a youngster of determination, I suppose, when I look back on it. Pusey still wasn't interviewed. My story had not appeared. And he finally agreed to an interview. And it was with a television Sunday morning show. I can't remember what it was. Nationwide television program where he'd be interviewed. I was so angered by this, really, personally, because, he wouldn't speak to us. He went for his first interview to a television program. And I said, I showed up at the television studio in Boston, where the interview was, positioned myself directly behind the cameras that were filming, or whatever one says, broadcasting this interview with President Pusey. And when President Pusey finished, the show ended, he had to walk out past the cameras, and I grabbed him again, and this time interviewed him, filed the interview that day, and no one, including Scotty Reston, objected.